Good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin my lecture this evening by thanking Sanne Hoffman and the Danish Institute in Athens and our co-sponsors at the American School of Classical Studies for inviting our research group to speak with you throughout this autumn and winter. Tonight, I'll be shifting our focus away from the architecture and experience of prisons in the ancient Mediterranean, which are the topics that have been covered by my colleagues who've already spoken in this series, to bring another form of punitive bodily control and confinement into dialogue with the topics already raised by my colleagues, namely the presence of exile on Cycladic islands. This is a topic that I came to as a member of recent and ongoing archaeological field projects in the Cyclades, where, in analyzing and interpreting our results, we've constantly been forced to grapple with themes like exile, piracy, control, and cultural liminality in our attempt to paint a picture of everyday life in the region during any period. But these themes become particularly acute when we focus on the region's time as part of the Roman Empire. On that note, and before I begin, I'd like to shine the spotlight on my colleagues from the Small Cycladic Islands Project and the Paros Palaiopyrgos Archaeological Survey. SCIP, as it's known, is a synergasia between the Effort of Antiquities of the Cyclades, the Norwegian Institute in Athens, and Carleton College, and it's co-directed by Dimitris Athanasoulis, Alex Nodell, and Zarko Tankovic. We conducted our 6th and final season of fieldwork last summer, and are now, we have quite a bit of data to work through, and there is a team on Syros right now working through that data. Our work on Palaiopyrgos on Paros is directed by Emlyn Dodd of the Institute of Classical Studies at the University of London and Apostolos Papadimitriou of the Effort of Antiquities of the Cyclades. The project is a collaboration between the Effort, the Australian Institute at Athens, the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens, and the British School at Rome. We just concluded our very first season of study in September, and I'm excited to share some preliminary results with you guys this evening. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the generous support for the prison project from the Carlsberg Foundation and the University of Copenhagen's Faculty of Theology and School of Archaeology, which has given us the excuse to come and share a series of interesting papers with you all in Athens. Okay. The use of Mediterranean islands in general, and the Cyclades in particular, as spaces of punishment, bodily control, and exile, is a topic about which much ink, both ancient and modern, has been spilled. While banishment, ostracism, and exile have long played a role in the range of judicial systems in the ancient Mediterranean, we see a particular shift in favor of islands as spaces of exile and confinement in the early years of the Roman imperial period. In 2 BCE, Augustus sentences his daughter, Julia, to exile on the island of Ventotene off the coast of Lazio after she was accused of adultery. And one of her accused lovers, Sempronius Gracchus, was sent to the island of Kerkana near Tunisia until his execution some 15 years later. While I'm careful not to leverage this particularly well-documented historical episode as a true sea change moment in the role of island exile within the larger Roman judiciary landscape, we do witness increasing discussion of this practice by ancient authors from this point forward. These authors paint a picture of most islands in the Aegean Sea as unbelievably isolated, almost entirely devoid of natural resources, fundamentally underdeveloped, and barely inhabited. Juvenal, Tacitus, and Plutarch variously engage with these, quote, rocks crowded with our noble exiles, and the island of Yaros is highlighted again and again as a space of almost unbelievable ruggedness, with no population, no water, and where even the rats eat iron. While each of these claims, as we will see, should be taken with a grain of salt, the place that the Cyclades comes to occupy in the Roman literary consciousness, and by extension, the Roman sense of their own imperial holdings, does offer interesting insight into the relationship between this region, its landscape, and the broader system of Roman imperial law. Modern historians, combing through our evidence for ancient exile on islands and elsewhere, have effectively illustrated a transition from occasional and exclusively super-elite practice to a more widespread and legally codified form of punishment for a range of transgressions, from adultery to treason. However, like the work of their ancient predecessors, these studies rarely comment on the implication of this practice on island landscapes, local communities, and the socio-economic network of Cycladic life. When they do, this scholarship tends to rather acritically rely on descriptions by ancient authors and early Western European travelers, perpetuating the desolate reputation of these islands. For example, one scholar in a 2003 article writes that Seriphos, quote, Seriphos seems to have been one of the most wretched places to be exiled in antiquity. Located between Sifnos and Kithnos, there are virtually no ancient remains on the small rocky outcrop, end quote. This description, of course, finds little support in the substantial archaeological remains on the island of ancient settlements, sanctuaries, an extensive network of mines and surveillance towers across the island's mountainous landscape, and I suspect people in this room would probably disagree with it. By contrast, and this will be old news to many of you, recent historical, literary, and archaeological scholarship in and of the Aegean world has been steadily reshaping our understanding of the Cyclades as a deeply networked, vibrantly interconnected, and resource-rich, especially during the period of Roman imperial authority. From the largest islands in the region to the tiniest and most remote, we find evidence for local and centralized investment alongside the movement of material goods and the development of local economies. However, even in recent scholarship, we occasionally find the invocation of our aforementioned literary tropes, squaring archaeological and historical data against an expected canvas of exiles, pirates, and other actors. While it's worth highlighting such activities as having left their mark on our perception of the ancient Cyclades, it's not immediately clear how best to identify exile, confinement, or piracy in the archaeological record. Andy Bevan and James Connolly turned to this same question when placing Antikythera's history as a haven for pirates, exiles, and hermits in the context of the data collected from their careful survey of the island. Without offering any real solutions, they suggest that, quote, it would be interesting to ascertain the degree to which portable material culture of exiles and internees really exhibits much that is different from the materiality of those less forcibly displaced who surround them. So, before exploring the material culture in question, let's take a look at a particularly vivid depiction of Cycladic exile in the Roman period that highlights a certain relationship between exile, island, community, and materiality. Philo of Alexandria offers a captivating tale of Aulus Aurelius Flaccus, prefect of Roman Egypt from 33 to 38 CE. Flaccus is charged with atrocities against Alexandria's Jewish community during a period of citywide riots. Philo, a contemporary and member of that very community, divides his account in two, exploring the crimes of Flaccus in the first half and his arrest, trial, and punishment in the second. Once condemned to exile, Flaccus has his property confiscated and he's banished, quote, from every one of the islands where life can prosper. This leads him to be condemned to exile on the island of Yaros, described as the most miserable island in the Aegean. At the word of this fate, a powerful ally of his requests that his sentence be commuted to the more hospitable Andros. Philo offers a detailed account of Flaccus's transport to Andros. Under a praetorian escort, he's transported from Rome to Brindisi, where he sets sail for Lecchio in the Corinthian Gulf. He's marched across the isthmus and placed aboard a small merchant vessel at Cancrii, where he sails to Piraeus, and from there hugs the Attic coast down to Sunia, and then hops from, quote, Macronisos to Chaea, Kithnos, and the rest, before arriving at Andros. Once on the island, his escort presents Flaccus to the popular assembly of the island, where they publicly announce his arrival and status as exile. They then depart the island, leaving him largely unattended and in the hands of the local community. Flaccus is described as being ashamed of his status and avoiding public spaces and public life, and remains at his home in the city. While the particulars of how he acquired that home are left unsaid, Philo does tell us that Flaccus purchases a small plot of agricultural land where he builds a farmstead and works the land. After some time, Caligula orders Flaccus to be executed and sends yet another retinue to Andros. This group encounters him traveling from his farm into town, resulting in an absolutely action-packed chase scene and a particularly gruesome execution. While we should absolutely challenge the historical accuracy of that story, it does offer a series of tangible conditions and experiences that we know to have been fundamental to the practice of island exile. From Flaccus's arrest to his trial, the confiscation of his property, and his condemnation, Philo is writing as someone with a familiarity of these processes within the Roman legal system, from which he builds a narrative of how it may have been experienced. Yet, our two pieces of material evidence, and these are about the only two, that have been linked to exile on Andros, have been used to argue the exact opposite. The first is an inscription on the left, an honorific decree for an elite Roman couple, Egnatia Maximilla and Glydius Gallus, who were exiled to the island by Nero in 65. While only a single data point, their experience stands in stark contrast to Flaccus, marked by a clear engagement with and investment in their community during their time in exile. The second example on the right, a votive dedication from an unyet discovered Mithraeum at Palaiopyrgos, names a group of Praetorian guardsmen stationed on Andros during the reign of Septimius Severus. While Nicholas Reed's 1975 interpretation of this inscription as evidence for the presence of a, quote, small prison camp on the island is perhaps not entirely substantiated by the text, it does indicate a sustained imperial presence on an island that is often linked to processes like exile and imprisonment. One factor left to interrogate in Philo's account of his exile of Flaccus is his relationship with the city and the landscape of Andros. Although his substantial wealth and property were confiscated, Flaccus acquires a home in town and even succeeds in purchasing a farmstead in the countryside. This is a pattern in other literary depictions of Roman exile on the islands and elsewhere in the empire, as illustrated in Mary Bragington's excellent 1944 article on the topic. Read it. But what are we to make of this link between exiles and rural life as either a literary trope or a historical reality? To again summon Bevan and Connolly, one would exile or piracy or any of these other notorious activities for which the Cyclades were best known present a material culture that is in some way distinct from the broader archaeological record of the countryside. These questions demand careful study of the archaeology of the rural Cyclades, and the two projects that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the Small Cycladic Islands Project and the Paros Palaiopyrgos Archaeological Survey, or project, in concert with other surveys, legacy data sets, and ethnographic studies, are offering unprecedented insight into our understanding of life in the Cycladic hinterlands on a diachronic scale. Fans of this lecture series may also recognize Palaiopyrgos as one of the towers that has been argued to play a role in bodily confinement. While both Skip and Palaiopyrgos are survey projects, they represent archaeology on two very different scales, one being exceptionally broad and comparative, the other significantly more focused and concentrated. Over 6 seasons of fieldwork, Skip set out to systematically and intensively survey 87 currently uninhabited islands across the Cyclades. The map here on the left highlights the locations of each of these islands and when they were surveyed, representing a range of island types in terms of size, topography, natural resources, and proximity or isolation from one another or their nearest inhabited neighbor. Before this project began, most of these islands had been subject to very little or no previous study, and while we were hopeful, we're not entirely certain of what we would find when we visited them. Research took the form of a systematic intensive fieldwalking survey following standard methodologies with some modifications to account for topography and the logistics of developing not one but 87 individual surveys in very short order. For each island, one or more teams of fieldwalkers systematically surveyed the island, counting and collecting ceramic sherds, obsidian tools, and other pieces of material culture. At the same time, a separate team was responsible for digital documentation of the entire island and study of all instances of preserved architecture, landscape modifications, and other instances of human activity. A final team recorded the island more holistically, focusing on the geology, vegetation profile, topographic characteristics, and the presence of harbors and other factors key to island life. Perhaps the most substantial conclusion from this project, and the most straightforward, is that these small islands preserve incredibly rich archaeological data, highlighting important roles within larger economies, settlement patterns, and island lifeways on a diachronic scale. If we focus our attention here on the islands surrounding Paros and Andiboros, which form something of a coherent group in terms of their location, we can explore the range of data that Skip collected and what they tell us about the role of small islands in the history of the Cyclades. Shown here are the overall artifact densities for islands that we surveyed in 2019, for example, with darker areas in red representing higher concentrations of material culture. The results between each island are, generally speaking, quite different from one another in scope and chronology. The data from some islands corresponds with our evidence for activity on Paros itself. For example, high densities of early Bronze Age, late Roman, and early Byzantine material on Dryonisi mirror patterns of contemporary activity on around the village of Drios. Furthermore, terraces built across the entire island, while difficult to assign to a particular period, highlight the integration of the offshore islet into the broader agricultural economy of southeastern Paros. Other islands present much more unique archaeological signatures, where small, remote, rugged places could fulfill very particular roles. A premier example of this phenomenon is Vriocastro, northeast of Paros, where we encountered an island that had been transformed into a floating castle, ringed by thick walls, large towers, and fortified entrances at the north and south of the island. The vast majority of the pottery collected in the island were closed cooking and transport vessels dating to the Middle and Late Byzantine periods, seemingly intended to support a garrison stationed on an island with no agricultural resources or fresh water of its own. While not direct evidence for activities like piracy, for example, in its own right, the construction and maintenance of a large fortification on a resource-poor island almost certainly references anxieties in the medieval Aegean, with this island intended, at least in part, to alleviate danger and control the busy strait between Paros and Naxos. Each of these islands is, of course, still a part of the contemporary landscape of Paros and Andiboros, and many of them feature in the myths and stories told by local fishermen, sailors, priests, and the community at large who engage with them on a regular basis. It is under these circumstances that we find our only mention of bodily control and confinement on one of these islands surrounding Paros, albeit under very different circumstances to our Roman exiles. In 1882, during their travel and research throughout the Cyclades, Theodore and Mabel Bent hire a local fisherman who they call Zeppo for a cruise around the uninhabited island of Despotico, southwest of Andiboros. Theodore Bent writes that, quote, "We sailed past Strongylo one day with Zeppo, who trembled like an aspen leaf at the sight of it, for his recollections of it were gruesome." The fears of Bent's interlocutor are made clear as he goes on to describe how Zeppo had been abducted during a winter quail hunting trip on Despotico by a group of goat thieves from Naxos. The bandits caught Zeppo, who had overheard their plans, and left him stranded on Strongylo with only a loaf of bread. Zeppo remarks, quote, "I knew every inch of Strongylo well, and I knew that it was exceedingly barren, and at that time of year, presumably summer, scarcely any herbs worth eating grew there. Moreover, there is not a mandra or a church on the island. During his time stranded on the island, he took shelter in a cave, drank from a perennial spring, and lit a rescue beacon atop the highest point on the island each night, before falling into a fever. After an unspecified time, he was rescued by shepherds from Despotico." This tale, filled with exaggerations and superstitions, nevertheless offers some key insight into local relationships with uninhabited islands, like Strongylo. It also presents an interesting case where we can explore a more informal form of opportunistic island confinement. Zeppo is marooned on an island not due to his committing a crime, but witnessing one. While a 19th century case study, it presents two key points for our understanding of exile more broadly. The first is that this practice, or similar practices, could affect a wider range of society than the elite Romans who we have encountered up until this point. The second is that, without personal anecdotes and local folklore, These instances are otherwise unattested in the historical record. But what does the archaeology of the island look like? How does it correspond to Zeppo's description of the island in the 1880s? And what insight, if any, does it offer into the Roman Cyclades? At 1.65 square kilometers, Strongylo is the largest island surveyed by Skip in the Paros Andros group. Required an entire week of fieldwork, which for our project is like the most time that you spend on one of these islands. Located at the extreme southwest of the archipelago, it is separated from Despotiko by a 750-meter strait of sheltered deep water. It's densely vegetated, fed by a handful of freshwater springs and seasonal streams that collect in several deep ravines that empty into the sea. The topography of Strongylo is significantly more rugged than the other islands that we've explored so far this evening, with steep cliffs on the west and a high summit in the center that reaches an elevation of 183 meters. All safely walkable areas were intensively surveyed, and the remainder of the island was systematically explored in a more extensive fashion by a gentleman who's sitting in the back. Counter to Zeppo's claim that Strongylo was devoid of sheepfolds, churches, or any other evidence of human activity, we recorded a wide range of interesting archaeology across the entire island. We walked 162 survey units, we documented almost 10,000 pieces of pottery, 265 obsidian tools, and 61 pieces of built architecture or infrastructure. Altogether, these data paint a picture of human activity on the island as early as the late Neolithic period and the presence of large terrace settlement here on the eastern coast of the island as early as the early Bronze Age. While there appears to be a hiatus of occupation in the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, it again appears occupied from the Archaic period onward. Now, more difficult to determine is the nature of this occupation and whether our evidence represents continual year-round settlement or more seasonal occupation intended to capitalize on abundant freshwater and arable land. Indeed, feature documentation and aerial LiDAR analysis discovered that the island is almost entirely covered in agricultural and structural terraces, with a wide range of typologies highlighting, if not sustained settlement, protracted investment in maximizing the island's agricultural potential, likely from the Bronze Age onward. Our evidence for Roman and late Roman occupation of Strongylo presents a somewhat different picture of life on the island. Settlement had shifted during the Archaic and Classical periods to Agios Yorgos, here in the northeast of the island, and a watchtower was constructed at the highest point of the island, the site of Zeppo's beacon. While the early Roman evidence is a bit murky, we did record a significant ceramic assemblage at the site that seems to cluster somewhere around the 5th century, suggesting a well-connected late antique community on the island. This area also presented a dense network of architectural remains, likely dating to the same period, including the use of spoliated marble fragments from the sanctuary of Apollo on Despotiko to embellish what seems to be a 3-aisled basilica in the center of the settlement. Settlement at Agios Yorgos persisted into the Middle Byzantine period, and several smaller complexes are constructed in the island's hinterland during that time. But what are we to make of this protracted period of more sustained settlement on the island? There's no mention of it in the sailing itineraries or other documents until after its abandonment sometime in the 13th century. Later, the island is featured in both the verse text and accompanying map of the Paros Antipros archipelago by Bartolomeo degli Sonnetti in 1485. In the text, Strongylo is grouped together with Despotiko and referred to simply as the rocks, and both islands feature small annotations of ruined settlements. With Strongylo, then, we're presented with the picture of a robust, persistent island community, with clear moments of local architectural and agricultural investment. While certainly part of the larger networks of the Paros Antipros archipelago and the broader Aegean world, this is almost certainly an independent community, located at the far side of an often uninhabited Despotiko, that leaves little memory of its existence in the local memory or literature of the region. So does our fieldwork on the island offer any insight into the Cyclades crawling with exiles or pirates, or is it simply a small coastal settlement on a well-watered island? Perhaps the most pressing, for the purposes of this talk, was the question of whether Bence Zeppo is the first individual who found himself cast on the island against his will, or, perhaps most appropriately, were his captors the first group to make use of the island as a place of confinement. We again see little about his experience, real, imagined, embellished, or otherwise, that leaves a particularly enduring mark on the archaeology of the island. If we return to the island of Paros itself, we have the opportunity to juxtapose these results against a site that has been, I would say, convincingly argued to have played a role in bodily confinement. Palaiopyrgos lies at the intersection of 4 modern fields in a small dirt track at the north end of Paros, near the sheltered waters of Nausa Bay. A well-built round tower with several courses of masonry preserved, it occupies a rather low topographic position amidst a large area of arable land. It has therefore long been thought to be linked to nearby agricultural activity rather than serving as any sort of watchtower, like our example from Strongylo. Palaiopyrgos was carefully studied by Hasselberger in the 1970s, who dates the structure to the 4th century BC and explores several peculiarities preserved in the tower's architecture. One of these characteristics is the presence of door jamb cuttings that seem to indicate, in addition to a thick wooden door, the tower was secured from the outside with a large iron grille. Hasselberger argues that this configuration is linked to the practice of using the ground floor of agricultural towers as livestock lockups in the evenings, protecting local flocks from bandits and thieves. In what I would say is a seminal article on Greek towers, Morris and Papadopoulos offer an alternative interpretation based on careful study of similar structures from other islands and the Greek mainland. In so doing, they ask whether certain features of these towers, such as the aforementioned grille, were meant to limit access to these towers, or are they instead designed to prevent escape from within? Whether intended for enslaved laborers, women, or convicts, these structures become spaces of confinement for Morris and Papadopoulos, symbolic of the inherently exploitative economies of classical, Hellenistic, and Roman Greece. With that debate squarely in our mind, my colleagues and I wondered whether anything about the landscape around Palaiopyrgos might shed additional light into questions of its chronology, use, and integration within broader agricultural networks. That this tower was located within eyesight of several islands surveyed by Skip offered the additional opportunity to directly explore the relationship between data collected on larger Cycladic islands like Paros and their much smaller uninhabited neighbors. To accomplish this, we targeted the 4 fields around Palaiopyrgos for a broad interdisciplinary survey. The core of the project was a careful magnetometry survey of the entire study area, carried out by Stephen Kay, Elena Pomar, and Chris Whitaker from the British School at Rome. To contextualize our magnetometry results, we undertook a pedestrian survey of the study area following the same methods used on Skip to facilitate comparison between these 2 datasets. Finally, we digitally documented the entire study area, the tower, and 5 exploratory trenches that had been dug by our colleagues in the Ephoria. Covering an area of roughly 3 hectares, our geophysics recorded a series of anomalies across the entire study area. Preliminary interpretation of those anomalies, shown here, highlights several long linear features that are likely earlier field divisions and irrigation channels. Closer to the tower, though, we have groups of anomalies to the southwest and to the southeast and the west that seem to indicate preserved architecture and accumulated rubble, likely part of a larger agricultural complex within which these towers are often incorporated. The chronology of these structures is not immediately evident, although the sondage that it was placed immediately against the tower exposed a short segment of walling that abuts its exterior face. Field walking further complicates our chronological picture of occupation and use of the area around the tower. Ceramic material was documented in high quantities in all survey units, although densities were, and this is not going to be very surprising, highest near to the tower itself. While we saw very little in the way of prehistoric ceramics, several obsidian tools point to at least ephemeral activity during the Neolithic or Bronze Age. Our earliest historic material at the site is the presence in, I would say, rather high quantities of large decorated pithoi of a local production, which have been dated to the 7th century BC based on stratified deposits elsewhere on Paros. Sherds with the same, they call kalamoti decorative technique, were documented by Skip on the nearby island of Ikonomu in the Bay of Nausa, and there is an enormous example, you may be familiar with it, of the type on display at the Archaeological Museum of Paros that comes from a funerary context on Andros. No other contemporary archaic material was noted during our initial analysis of the pottery, which is still preliminary, and it remains unclear whether these pithoi indicate a phase of archaic occupation at the site, which would become Palaiopyrgos, or whether they were later transported to the site as antiques for reuse in storage and agricultural production, which happens. Ceramics of the classical, Hellenistic, and Roman periods cluster in exceptionally high quantities around the tower, presenting the full suite of domestic and agricultural industrial assemblages. Both fine and coarseware vessels for eating and drinking are represented, including many Attic imports. Transport amphorae were recorded in high quantities with a particularly high density to the south and southeast of the tower. Corinthian pan roof tiles were also found near the tower, although likely not for its roof, offering additional indirect evidence for the presence of other structures in the immediate vicinity. Activity at the site continues into late antiquity with very high densities of 6th and 7th century local amphora sherds of a similar type to those excavated from the kilns very nearby at Lageri in the Zoodokos Pigi Bay. We also documented several highly vitrified examples of the very same shapes, alluding to the presence of what we suspect is a ceramics workshop at or around the site of Palaiopyrgos itself. With all this data for storage and transport, our best evidence for agricultural production itself was found near the tower, where Emlyn-Dodd recognized a large press counterweight, shown up here, used to produce wine or olive oil. With a preserved weight of almost 400 kg, having been split almost in half, it was rather hard to maneuver, but we did manage to document it in the round, discovering that it had been inverted and recut for reuse, although for the same purpose, just with a slightly different configuration. So, what can our fieldwork at Palaiopyrgos teach us, especially considering ongoing debates about the chronology and function of Cycladic towers and their potential to shed light on episodes of confinement or exploitation? High quantities of storage and transport wares confirm its association with local agricultural production, while the counterweight and wasters pushes us to incorporate this within a broader suite of production and processing. Moreover, the diachronic range of pottery and architecture in the vicinity of the tower places it at the center of agricultural activity for a good deal longer than previously thought. But what about the individuals who were tasked with undertaking this labor at any particular time? Apart from our architectural evidence mentioned above, I'm not sure if our survey gets us any closer to that answer about who or what was locked up in this tower at any given point: livestock, slaves, criminals, or anyone else. Apart from the grill cutting, we see none of the evidence for confinement that has been seen and will be explored by my other colleagues during this lecture series. Things like graffiti, spaces of confinement, shackle anchors, and other features of that sort. But then again, would we expect to find this? We're certainly dealing with an agricultural economy that was founded on a wide range of exploitative behaviors. But if our only insight into the material realities of this practice is through the lens of features like an externally locking grill, how can we leverage the archaeological record to help us better understand pre-modern confinement? Returning to Bevan and Connolly's question on the impact of practices like exile on the pre-modern archaeological record, I wonder whether more progress could be made by asking why such a practice tends not to leave an indelible mark on the archaeological record, rather than how we might best isolate or interrogate it. That question becomes all the more interesting when we juxtapose our conversation this evening with the more recent archaeological and historical record of the Cyclades. Throughout the 20th century, the islands of the Aegean once again found themselves as places of exile and incarceration, beginning with ad hoc deportation of labor organizers in the 1910s, and culminating with the development of a complex industry that adopted entire islands as spaces of imprisonment, exile, and surveillance, and re-education. While under different circumstances and at a much greater scale than any pre-modern example, we do see distinct parallels between these episodes. Perhaps the most striking, you see it on the left, is that many of these same islands, for which we have evidence for pre-modern exile, mostly textual, were once again chosen to fulfill this very same purpose in the 20th century. However, unlike its ancient predecessor, this 20th century episode left an incredibly indelible mark on the archaeology, topography, and memory of these spaces, both complicating the relationship between punishment and material culture and encouraging us to explore this phenomenon on a diachronic scale. That these practices took place in living memory has resulted in a great deal of scholarship on the topic, alongside the preservation of an incredible amount of documentary and ethnographic sources. In the Anglophone world, perhaps the most impactful study is Margaret Kenna's ethnography of exile communities during the Metaxas regime, focused on her fieldwork in Anafi. While she primarily explores the relationship and societal structure that emerged from this practice, her scholarship is filled with the everyday materiality of exile, presenting an interesting mix of local and more individualized architectural, decorative, and personal tastes that have left their mark on the island today. Alongside communities of exile who were under supervision and surveillance but largely independent, we see other forms of confinement during the 20th century. This includes the development of re-education camps on islands like Makronisos. Starting in 1947, the island was transformed into a series of large military camps where suspected left-leaning thinkers and members of the military were sent until they were deemed to have adopted a non-threatening nationalist ideology. Alongside a regime of punishment, abuse, and labor, the exiles were tasked with constructing the camps themselves and other structures like enormous, classically inspired theaters. Honda van Steen has explored these theaters and the plays by classical authors, which were put on by the exiles, in a tenuous agreement with their captors, where both communities understood very different messages from the productions. The theaters, the camps themselves, and other remnants are still preserved on the island today, which has remained depopulated and rarely visited, but a constant presence along the east coast of Attica. The final category of 20th century exile, and by far the most notorious, is the development of harsh prisons and concentration camps on islands like Yaros, the same Yaros. After the Second World War, Yaros was expropriated by the Greek state, displacing a small population who had developed a modest but sustainable agricultural and livestock economy. In their place, the entire east coast of the island was transformed into a series of enormous open-air prison camps that held tens of thousands of individuals over several episodes, from 1947 till 1974. Conditions in these camps were terrible in terms of treatment, labor expectations, medical care, and shelter. And at the so-called Fourth Bay, the furthest south, if I had had a map up there, the prisoners were tasked with constructing a series of structures that had the intention of establishing an enormous permanent prison on the island. This resulted in the main prison building, shown here in the bottom right, a 7,500 square meter behemoth, which I think, and you guys can correct me, that remains to this day the largest building in the entire Cyclades. While never fully completed, the structure served to reshape not only the camp within which it was built and the bay where it was located, but it serves, and it continues to serve to this day, as a symbol of exile and incarceration in the Cyclades. This building, like many others on the island, accomplishes this both in its architecture and the evidence that points to the individuals, both exiles and guards, who occupied this space. While Yaros has never been systematically studied, the photos and videos taken by visitors to the island indicate the undeniable effect that this practice has had on the contemporary archaeological record of this island and other islands like it. In addition to the enormous material record left by the practices of exile and incarceration on the Cyclades in the 20th century, we see the simultaneous development of a reputation for many of these spaces that parallels, or maybe even revives, the same literary tropes that we saw earlier leveraged by Roman authors. Yaros in particular is again described and maintains a reputation today as uninhabitable, harsh, waterless, things like that. Descriptors that directly clash with the scant archaeological evidence from the island, the epigraphic evidence from the island, and the more robust ethnographic attestations of its most recent permanent population from the first half of the 20th century. From a contemporary perspective, it is interesting that these islands, these exile islands, are once again described in this way, despite featuring the same vegetation, the same hydrology and landscape profiles as neighboring islands that are regularly considered some of the most beautiful places in the entire world. One wonders then whether the development of these tropes in both antiquity and in modern memory lies less in any physical reality and is instead linked to the activities that took place upon these spaces. While I'll leave any definite answers or progress about how best to explore an archaeology of exile to Christina's response to this paper and our discussion afterward, there may be a closer link between our ancient and modern exiles than one might think. During his 5 years of exile on Yaros, the novelist Andreas Nenadakis kept a very careful diary. And in 1948, when excavating the foundations for what would become the House of the Commandant, which is still present on the island today, Nenadakis describes how he and his fellow exiles uncovered a series of graves with figured pottery and other associated finds. While the guards were shouting at them to carry off the large slabs that lined the tomb for reuse in the prison, Nenadakis wonders whether two communities of exiles separated by millennia were meeting one another face to face. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for a very rich lecture. It's a super interesting project. Thank you for lifting the veil of this fieldwork that you've done and the range of sites that this have revealed on the one hand, but also the linking it to a project that sort of probably is more of a social phenomenon or focused on social phenomenon. Now, incarceration is really social. That's very spatial thing. You're put in a place. But I noticed that in your abstract, you actually avoided using the term incarceration. You come back to it in the more contemporary period, which makes very good sense. But for the Roman period, at least, this is more to do with exile and bodily control. I quite like the idea of bodily control. I'm sure that in the audience there will be specific or questions about the Cycladic aspects, which I will not go into, but I would like to hear a little bit more from you about the social aspects, because I've just come out of 4 weeks of fieldwork, and when we are in the field, and you have demonstrated that richly, space is Cartesian. We walk in systematic grids. It's about points and it's about shapes. So it's very physical. On the one hand, and then there are the literary tropes. The members of exile or members of the elite who are sent into exile. They are transported from their network and their families and the place of business, and they are placed somewhere else. And it's a horrible experience, obviously, apparently. First of all, you mentioned initially that there is now evidence that this is not only an elite phenomenon. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, so if our earliest evidence for exile is kind of limited to imperial family and imperial family adjacent actors, it becomes within 30 years or something a way to control political dissidents and folks who, I mean, are still in the kind of most, the upper half of the societal tiers, but not like governors of places or things like that. So perhaps one of the more interesting case studies, which focuses on Yaros itself, is the exile of a guy called Musonius Rufus, a Stoic philosopher, who writes about his exile. and this was cut from the talk, but who writes about his exile, the experience of his exile, and the fact that his exile in his work allowed him to get more work done, which I think many of us would welcome in the middle of a semester. But one of the interesting things that, like this joining of fieldwork from these projects and these research questions, which are kind of cyclical because it's the fieldwork that prompted the kind of close reading of all of this ancient history where these tropes are kind of redeployed and then are trying to justify the results on them. But one of the more interesting results is that the themes of disconnectedness, I mean, you are outside of the metropolis. You are removed from Rome and put somewhere else. But our Roman authors describe these places as unbelievably disconnected, and I mean, disconnected in the sense that they're not Alexandria or something, but unbelievably isolated, cut off from society, and uninhabited, right? And what we're finding from fieldwork on these places, large islands, small islands, these are like lived places entirely, right? And this is a practice, whether it affects the exilee is, you know, it could be a never to be found person, but what we do have is evidence of the people and the lifestyles of the individuals like on Andros who would have just been subjected to this practice kind of secondarily, right? And who would have received the exile and integrated them into society, either having them complain and be sad or setting up honorific decrees for all of the great stuff that they did while they were in exile. So approaching the ancient practice, which is difficult to isolate, you're able to kind of leverage this sort of fieldwork to call the like claims that are modern claims that like they were exiled to a particular island because it's so far away and so disconnected. Well, it's like if you get exiled to Yaros, you're in the center of the Cyclades, and every island can see you. Or if you get exiled to Macronisos, you can like see Attica and almost swim to it. So it's this kind of the choice of islands, the fact that islands are used in antiquity, reused in the 20th century, the same islands for, you know, similar purposes, confining people, whether through kind of one-off exiles, group exiles, or things like industrialized imprisonment and a phenomenon that's the same but different. It's particular places, and it's not the most marginal. Otherwise, like everyone would be imprisoned on Anafi or something, or one of the, like Strongylo, one of these islands that's really like in the middle of nowhere. And those are the kind of like early conclusions that I'm drawing out. That like Musonius Rufus, people were like, you know, he writes that people were sailing to the island. He would give lectures, and then they would like go away, and then people got mad at him for doing that because you're supposed to be kind of disconnected, but. These, you know, the Cyclades are an inherently connected and networked place in all periods, right? And so choosing them for their disconnectedness and their go think about what you've done and sit by yourself is not like substantiated archaeologically.
Well, I suppose that depends what you expect, because from what you're saying, would we then not, these are members of the elite, and they actually pay for their exiles themselves, don't they?
Sometimes, yeah.
Would you not? I mean, so these are not, it's not the Roman emperor who would build prominent sheds on tiny islands without water to house these people. They probably bring with them their lifestyle, although they're not allowed to bring their entire network. So would you not? Does that not mean that what we should expect, how exiles would be living, would be something that would be more comparable to the lifestyle they actually enjoyed back in the metropolis?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so if you think about exile outside of islands more broadly, right, there is a phenomenon of when it's about to get boring. There are two forms of exile. There's relegatio and deportatio. The one, you get to keep your citizenship and your stuff, and you get sent to your villa, and you think about it. In deportatio, which is like the Rufus one, you get sent, all your things you take, and your citizenship is stripped. You go forever, and then eventually somebody gets upset at you and kills you or something like that. So there's variation in that regard. But what we don't see, I mean, on the islands, which are like the exile landscapes par excellence literarily, we don't see like I mean, would we expect it? We don't see the presence of like transplanted villa rustica. We don't see the you know, one house that is like full of sigillata and everything else is local, right? It's not like, I wonder whether whether that sort of approach is gonna link any fruit. There's like a sampling error, which is like, are you gonna find every exile house in the Cyclades? But the other is, we see in the 20th century, and that's why using some of these more modern parallels on places like Anafi, you see a blend almost immediately of the use and engagement with even, you know, elite, like members of Athenian society who were being exiled in the 20th century, intellectuals and whatever. Some of the things that they are said to use and bring with them, and the rosters of equipment and the things that people are sending them or whatever, are very cosmopolitan, and some of the things are very much exactly what you would expect. Activities, behaviors, and things that they were using, places they were living, are very like Cycladic vernacular, right? So it's this kind of immediate blend in the 20th century. And the question is, can you like isolate aspects of that are like exile universals or imprisonment universals using one parallel, ethnographic parallel, and then go like interrogate the archaeological record? I think like we all know that that's not how we should be doing archaeology, but it is interesting to kind of use those things as anchor points to then ask these questions about the transplant of not only a person, but their way of life. We certainly see from the example of Andros that you have one exile who we are told their life seems to be very different, and we have a husband and wife couple whose life seems to be very elite, and the usual stuff that people do in their like hometowns where they're setting up, you know, I don't know, building buildings or doing whatever they did to justify their honorific decree. It's that the kind of social and the archaeological, and then the landscape, right? The places where these things were happening, all of that is the kind of nexus of, I don't know, that needs to be peeled apart to kind of answer the question, if there is an answer, right?
Because I suppose being able to grow fruit, I mean, the example from Palaiopyrgos, which seems relatively luxurious, I would say, and also the locations.
Yeah.
It's the Andros to the north, and there's something else.
It's fantastic, yeah.
So in a way, it's quite typical. You can see everything. You're in this gorgeous landscapes, the beautiful bay, and clearly there's production, agricultural production going on. So it doesn't seem to be a very hard lifestyle. It may not have friends coming over every night to talk about books and learn text and philosophy, but on the other hand, it seems a not uncomfortable lifestyle. Certainly, so the uncomfortable part of exile, maybe that is more in your mind in a sense.
Sure.
In the minds of the exiles.
Sure.
And I can't help but remember Priscilla said that people make of landscapes what they will.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that if you're stuck in a place, it doesn't really matter how fantastic your life is there, how beautiful it is. If you think of it as an exile, then it is all.
Yeah.
The exiles you mentioned in the beginning, if we're trying to think of the comparison with the more modern exiles, those are always individuals, aren't they? There are no places in the Cyclades of forced labor camps in the in the Roman period.
Yeah, so there are group exiles of like the communities that get shifted from one place to another. I mean, is that a form of exile or relocation or whatever? I mean, that wouldn't fall under the, like, we have 800 cases of relegatio and I'm the judge and I have to like, you know, hit the gavel for every single one of you. This is like a kind of big decision-making process that's happening. So you have movement of people to islands on the Ionian coast, not in the Cyclades proper. big communities. You have the exile of small, like religious groups or seers and kind of these people and their followers who are the, the sorts of people that are not elites, but are the kind of, like they could cause trouble. So isolate them somewhere, not unlike the 20th century where it's like, oh, you're a little bit wanting to start a trade union. Why don't you go sit on Naxos for a little bit and farm a potato or something? So, yeah, you see it in that regard, but you don't see, like in the classical period where you have like real big, the movement of like war captives at a large scale being placed on islands as holding like as Facteria or something like that. You don't see, or like Evia, southern Evia. That seems to, in the Roman period, and it could be a phenomenon of like elite people writing about elite people. This is, that's what they tend to focus on, right? And that's what like a comb through of the 5 or 6 like kind of big synthetic takes about like legal studies on exiles where they go and they quantify everything and who are these people and where they're coming from and stuff. It is even when you have like one-offs that you can kind of challenge who's being exiled, it's an elite practice.
Because I suppose exile groups must be a very different process, because they do exactly, you actually take their network and move that with them. So it must be a very different kind of exile. It needs to be disconnected in a different way. And of course, the forced labor with the mines is a good example of that. But also, because this is a case that's related to Cyprus, I'm reminded of it. So in 309, 10, there is a story about how Christians are moved, they're distributed from the mines of Palestine because they have become too strong a community, basically. So they have to be dispersed.
In late antiquity, this becomes in late antiquity, especially like Byzantine Aegean, it really takes off, right? If you look forward, there are everyone from the imperial family is being exiled constantly. You have exactly this, like these big communities being moved around to places like Cyprus and along North Africa and stuff like that. There's a great book about it that I think I had in there, Exile in the Later Roman Empire. That gets into those themes, and it is like going back to Anafi. When these communities were exiled, they set up small communist communities where their goods were brought in and then redistributed, and people could choose to join them, and then they would be part of that network, or they could come and say, actually, I'm not a part of that, and then they would be kind of ostracized. And this is what Margaret Kenna's book kind of highlights, is the movement of those aren't pre-existing communities, but those are like pre-existing philosophies that come with them. And then these utopias can actually like happen or whatever in these spaces based on the movement.
And of course, even in those cases where we know there are large groups, archaeologically, they're really hard to.
I mean, this is like I gave a paper at the EA earlier this year about the limestone quarries in Syracuse and the kind of huge imprisonment of the Sicilian expedition. And the fact that you don't have any evidence for that gigantic practice. And why is that? It's because quarries are negative spaces. So any surface upon which a prisoner of the Athenians who couldn't recite Euripides or whatever the story was stayed would have been quarried away. But what you do find there is the use of the same place as a late antique prison with anchors for shackles and graffiti and all of that stuff. So you have these kind of like, as here, you have these similar spaces being used for similar purposes under different circumstances at different times. Yeah.